Hi, everybody. It looks like we're live. Thank you for joining us today for the IWF Book Club. We are thrilled that nearly 250 of you have decided to join us today to discuss this month's book, Justice on Trial, by Mollie Hemingway and Carrie Severino. I'm Jennifer Braceras, and I'm joined today by my friend and colleague, Inez Stetman. For the next hour, we'll be discussing this terrific and timely book and have a chance to talk with the authors about the confirmation process, Justice Kavanaugh's contentious hearings, and the lessons for the next Supreme Court confirmation process. Okay, so before we invite the authors on stage to talk with us today, I'm going to kick it over to Inez, who will explain how the virtual platform that we're using works.
We're just going to get some of that technical information up front and get it out of the way and get to the more exciting part of this discussion. But in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you're going to find a chat room tab. I see a lot of you have already found that tab. If you don't see that tab, select the caret in the top right corner to open that chat window. So we encourage all of you to join in the chat discussion under that tab. Second, the whole point of this virtual book club event is for all of us to participate in this discussion together. So when we bring on Mollie and Carrie in just a moment, they and we want to hear from you and we want to hear your questions. So next to that chat room tab, there's another tab, which is for questions. Please post your questions in that tab because that's where I'm going to be checking to select audience questions to then present to Mollie and Carrie. So please post your questions in that tab. If you post your question in the chat instead, I may not see it, right? We'll be checking the chat, but because we'll be having this discussion, we may not be able to check the chat as often. So the questions tab, keep it please only for questions, and you're much more likely to get your question selected from that tab. Finally, we're going to have a portion after the discussion with Mollie and Carrie where it's going to be Jennifer and I. And at that time, we would love to invite some of you up onto this virtual stage with us and to ask your question directly live on video. So if you do want to ask your question live on video, make sure that you leave a capital V next to that question in the questions tab. So that'll let us know that you want to ask it live yourself on video. And we've learned from past not so great experience that it's really important to have strong Wi-Fi and then to be participating on a computer in order to ask your question live on video, because we've had issues with phones or tablets. Video questioning doesn't always work great from those platforms. So if you want to ask your question live on video, I recommend that you're on a computer and make sure you have good Wi-Fi. Look at the chat, the questions tab. We have one more tab, and that is for polls. So we will be posting polls periodically in that tab. So remember to look through it and respond to the polls. Otherwise, then we can pull in some of those polls as part of the discussion. And then finally, at the end of our discussion, we'll be drawing 3 lucky winners who will receive copies of Justice on Trial signed by the authors and a Supreme Court Cases coffee mug. You must still be present in this virtual event in order to win when your name is announced. Apologies, I think maybe some of you can hear the siren outside my window, but so you must still be present in our discussion at that time at the end in order to win if your name is announced. So don't sign up early or you will miss your chance to win that. Okay, so now for the good stuff. Jennifer, take it from here.
Thanks, Inez. With the technical stuff out of the way, we are thrilled to have the opportunity to hear directly from the authors of Justice on Trial, Mollie Hemingway and Carrie Severino. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Hello.
Hi, guys.
Hi.
Hello. Hey, how are you doing?
We are so happy to have you here today. And we really could not have timed this event better. And we really look forward to talking to you, not just about the book, but about your thoughts for the process that's about to unfold within the next couple of weeks. But before we get into that, I just thought I'd throw it to Mollie to give us a quick background on why you guys wrote this book and why you decided to write it together.
Carrie and I were both involved in the Kavanaugh Confirmation process, and we had known each other before that, but we really got to know each other during that time because I was doing a lot of television coverage about the Kennedy opening, the vacancy, and who the potential nominees were, and then when it was Kavanaugh. And she was such an expert that I loved talking to her to get really good deep information about the process, about what was going on, about Kavanaugh's judicial record. And so after everything went crazy, in the confirmation process, there was a lot of interest in people writing books. And Ruth Marcus, who's a liberal, like far left opinion person at the Washington Post, got a contract to write a book on the Kavanaugh confirmation. And she said that she would do it as a reporter, not as the leader of the anti-Kavanaugh operation, which she was at the Washington Post. So a lot of people wanted to story. They were very knew it was a good story. They knew that what they'd done was interesting, and they would love to talk to people, but they didn't want to talk to someone who was so aligned with, running the anti-Kavanaugh operation. So there'd been a lot of interest out there, people who had wanted Carrie and me to write separately, and we decided to do it together. We knew it had to be done quickly, and that if we joined forces, we might be able to get it done. And we hadn't worked together as writers before, but it worked so well. And, we knew each other before, but we really knew each other after doing this like very intense process day after day. We interviewed more than 100 people for the book, key players in the White House, in the Senate, on the court, and people who knew the various parties that were involved. And it was a lot of really lengthy interviewing and then writing. And so we're very glad we did it. We knew it was an important story. We knew there was a lot of history that was relevant, and we're just very pleased that it worked out as well as it did.
So obviously, as Jennifer said, this is an incredibly timely topic given, and we will definitely get into more of the current events as we go along. But first, I wanted to get your thoughts. I mean, you write in this book about, for example, the Bork confirmation hearings. And in those, after those hearings, a disaster of those hearings, there's a warning issued, right, by Bork himself, saying, this process that requires this, and you detail all of this in your book, right, this incredible political team, right, and a nerve center and a media arm and a lobbying arm. How is that whole political process that is now necessary for the confirmation process, before we get to the sexual allegations and all of that, but even the quote unquote normal process now, how is all of that, is it compatible with the apolitical nature of the job? And how do those two sort of incompatible aspects within one person, right, within a nominee, you have to show that you are impartial and apolitical, and yet at the same time, it requires this political fight to get the job. I mean, how do you reconcile that going forward?
Yeah, it's a really challenging part of the process, because you're also talking about people that are getting confirmed who aren't politicians. And thank goodness, we don't need more politicians here in Washington. You want to have apolitical people on the bench. But our Constitution is actually written such that there is a political check on the nomination process. So the judges themselves should not obviously be performing a political role, but there's a political question initially to getting them on, because it is a politically elected person, the president, who nominates them, and a politically elected body, the Senate, that then does the confirmation process. I wish it didn't have to be this way. I think what Justice Scalia suggested, and what we talk about in the final chapter, is the idea that if courts were not acting so politically, maybe we wouldn't have this political fight going into it. We shouldn't have to have it be this kind of an in-depth political process. However, that's where we are in today. And I'll point out that it was interesting, obviously with Bork, it was really crazy, and it got crazier with Thomas. And Justice Ginsburg's own hearing was an attempt, I think, by Republicans at the time to give an olive branch and say, maybe we can defuse this process. Maybe if we're just really helpful. And even though she was known to be liberal, she had worked for the ACLU and the Reproductive Justice Project. And, there was no question where she stood on these things, but she was confirmed within 42 days and almost unanimously, with only 3 votes against her. So those olive branches, unfortunately, were soundly rejected. And in the Bush era, we had not just Supreme Court nominees, but appellate nominees being filibustered to high heaven over and over again. So where we are now is it certainly does require almost a campaign-like process to get someone confirmed. But I do think that at least in terms of the judges that we've seen President Trump trying to put on the court, they're approach to the court is one that is inherently not political, because the idea is if you have a philosophy like originalism and textualism, you're looking at not a political outcome in the case, but the actual words of the statute and the words of the Constitution. That whole idea of originalism, it was really an attempt to get the politics out of the court. And I think if we could get people across the political spectrum to agree that that's the most principled way to read the law, maybe we could start to take down the political temperature in the nomination and confirmation process.
Carrie, why do you think that Judge Kavanaugh, now Justice Kavanaugh's hearing, was so much more contentious than even Justice Gorsuch's just the year before? I mean, of course, the left did come out and try to stop him as well, but it didn't reach the level of hysteria that it did with Kavanaugh. And I'm wondering if you could tell us why you think that is.
Yeah, one of the things Mollie and I wanted to do was to set the stage for why things were so crazy. And what we learned in studying the history of the confirmation processes and talking to people who had been involved from the Reagan era on was that the level of intensity and craziness and insanity that surrounded these vacancies had less to do with the individual being nominated and had a lot to do with the stakes of the seat. So even going back to Bork, he was replacing a swing seat on the court. So just a couple of years earlier, you had Justice Scalia, who was very similar in his jurisprudential approach, confirmed unanimously. Two big things happened in the meantime there. The Senate went to the Democrats, but then also the seat was a high stakes swing seat. Similarly, in 1991, when Clarence Thomas was being confirmed, it was not the like for like kind of a conservative for conservative. He was replacing Thurgood Marshall, who was at the far left edge of the bench. And then you're going to put Clarence Thomas, who's now at the far right edge of the bench. When the stakes are that big, when there's a potential for shift up on the court, that's when you see the crazy things happening. So Gorsuch replacing Scalia, look, people on the left have still not gotten over the fact that he was the replacement for Scalia. They wanted Merrick Garland. So they're still really angry about that, but it wasn't anything compared to what happened with Kavanaugh. And unfortunately, the Kavanaugh replacing Kennedy as the swing vote was a serious thing where the court's swing seat was in play. Obviously, this year we're looking at a potentially even greater shift.
Right.
So speaking of shifts on the Supreme Court, this is obviously a really important political issue for voters, right? And we saw in the election of 2016 and in the primaries, as you detail in the book, something that hadn't happened before, which is a presidential candidate releasing a list of names, not just a list of qualifications that he or she would look for in Supreme Court nominees, but actually a list of names, right? And do you think that that's going to become a permanent feature of politics going forward? The list is going to become just a standard feature, given how the base, how much mistrust I think, especially the Republican base, has on about its own party's track record in terms of nominating justices and whether or not they actually turned out to be conservatives or originalists on the bench.
Right. So 2016 was such an interesting year. And we did spend a lot of time in the book discussing the story of how the list was created, because it played such a big role in Donald Trump's, not just his nomination by the Republican Party, but his confirmation, but his election in the general. And most of the times what happens when there's a Republican dealing with a vacancy is that the vacancy arises, and then a team of people start thinking through who would be a good replacement. And historically, this has not produced like the best results, not just because you have different factions fighting for their candidate and knocking out like the best alternatives and ending up with a consensus candidate who's less than ideal, but it also created like political concerns of a moment could really affect the nomination. Conservative voters cared deeply about the Supreme Court, and 1 in 4 of Donald Trump's eventual voters voted for him because of the Supreme Court. So that vacancy that arose due to Scalia's death became this very pivotal thing. There was actually a debate that same day that Scalia had died, and that night is when Donald Trump first named, it's common for Republican presidential candidates to say, I'll nominate someone in the mold of a Clarence Thomas, but they rarely get into the specifics of who they might actually name. Donald Trump named a couple of people that night, and he has a great reception to it. So he and his team come up with this idea to actually put forth a list of potential nominees. They put out the list, and people who were very worried about Donald Trump in the Republican Party started saying, yeah, he put out a list and all the names are great, because there were no complaints about who he put on that first list. So all the names are great, but he won't really pick from that list. So he updates the list a couple months later, and he pledges to pick only from that list. And he did, when he was elected president, pick from that list, and that's how Neil Gorsuch came on there. But he keeps the list going throughout his presidency. They just have a constant, ongoing vetting operation where they're working with people who really have the time to read people's opinions. They're trying to figure out not just who has the right judicial philosophy, but who has the strength to stay strong when they're on the court. It's been a problem with Republican nominees that they get to DC, they get on the court, peer pressure starts leading them astray. So they wanted a demonstrated commitment even when politics might lead them the other way. And then Trump famously updates the list again. That's how Amy Coney Barrett gets on, and also Brett Kavanaugh. And so when the Kennedy vacancy happens, they end up picking Kavanaugh, and then they updated the list again just a couple weeks ago, right before this new vacancy arose. So it seems to be very important, particularly for conservative voters. Now, of course, it's such a good idea that Democrats should probably do it too, and all other Republican candidates should do it too. But I wonder if it won't happen for the Democratic nominee or for Joe Biden, because he doesn't have a lot to gain by being honest about who he would put on the court. The left doesn't have the same disappointment in who their Democratic presidents have put on the court. They not only get good justices by their standards when the Democrats nominate, they also frequently get good ones when Republicans nominate. So there's not the same pressure that a conservative candidate might face. And so also, if he were to be honest about who he would put on the court, it's entirely likely that it would reveal how radical some of those people are, and it might turn off voters. And Joe Biden is very much hoping to present himself as a moderate. So I think a lot of American people would like to see a list like the one that Trump put out, but it might be more common to see in the Republican Party than the Democrat.
I want to pick up on a couple of things you said, Mollie, because I know in the book you guys talk about how when Hillary Clinton was asked, who would you nominate to the Supreme Court, she basically, instead of naming a person or a type of person or a judicial philosophy, she went through a laundry list of progressive policy agendas, right? Somebody who's in favor of abortion rights and LGBTQ rights and this and that and clean water and the other thing, as if the court is a super legislature, which we understand that it's not. But the Democrats have been sort of, I think, selling the voters this bill of goods over many decades that, if you don't get what you want from the legislature, you can go and get it from the court. And of course, that's not really how the court is supposed to work. How do you think that Trump's release of the list helps to educate the public about the proper role of the court? In other words, was it just the names that he put out? Because I imagine most individual voters, had never heard of Neil Gorsuch, right? But what did putting out that list tell them about the institutional role of the court?
Well, you're accurate with what you said about how Hillary Clinton had talked about what she was looking for in a Supreme Court justice. It's also true that sometimes people on the right have said something similar. They're looking for outcomes instead of what the judicial philosophy would be. So you'll hear people, including Donald Trump, say they're looking for pro-life justice or judge. And that is also actually inappropriate. You should be talking about their judicial philosophy and not about what outcomes you hope to seek, because that's the whole reason that the court has gotten to be this legislature, is that they aren't ruling based on the law, but on what they want the outcome to be. And it has worked pretty well for the left, that when they can't accomplish things through democratic means, when things are tested in the court of public opinion and they lose, they just run to the courts and they accomplish what they want to there. That is not healthy for the republic. But yeah, having this list out and having such a wide variety of people, men and women from across the country, and they were chosen again primarily for their judicial philosophy, as seen through established opinions. again, in not that long ago history, sometimes Republicans would pick stealth candidates, people without a good record, because they thought that was easier to get them through. And it was easier to get them through, but it sometimes caused disastrous results, most famously with David Souter, who was picked precisely because he didn't have a record. People were assured that he would be good. And as soon as he starts going through his confirmation hearings, people realize that his stated judicial philosophy is deeply at odds with this approach of looking at what the Constitution actually says and interpreting the law accordingly. But this list showed that people were chosen for their reasoning and their established record, and also for other things, like I mentioned, the strength that they'd shown under pressure, and the fact that they came from across the country was not lost on the political campaign. And they were looking for people who came from not just Washington, D.C., even if one of the candidates ended up being, precisely from Washington, D.C., Brett Kavanaugh.
So I'm going to pull in a question from our Great Questions tab. Please, as a reminder, put your questions there and not in the chat, because that's where I'm looking. This is from Lori, and she's asking about the procedures of the committee hearing and the Senate hearing as a whole. At the time, we know there were polls that showed, 70% of the American people or more were deeply unhappy with how the procedure ended up going during those hearings. Is there anything that, so I'll just read directly what Lori said, because I think she put it well. Procedurally speaking, in what ways could the Senate have limited the kangaroo court antics that happened during the Kavanaugh hearings? What lessons should the committee put into action for the coming hearings that we're all going to be experiencing in the next couple months?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, the good news, and partly thanks to 2020, one of the silver linings is one of the things the Senate is not going to have this time is public seats in the hearings. And they're doing that really, I think, for COVID-19 concerns, but it has a benefit, because as we were rewriting this book, it was so funny because we had to relive through all these interviews, all of this process with so many people. It was kind of like going through a roller coaster a million times over and over. And one of the things a lot of people even involved in it forgot were how crazy the Kavanaugh hearings episode 1 were. The first hearings before Christine Blasey Ford had come on the scene, before anyone but Dianne Feinstein knew that she existed, the hearings were already nuts. It was all political theater, no actual useful content for large portions. So remember, the beginning of the hearings, there's supposed to be a 10-minute opening statement for all the members of the committee. Chairman Grassley opens the hearing, and not 10 seconds into his 10-minute opening statement, he starts getting interrupted. And then the Democratic senators are interrupting him over and over, interrupting each other on top of interrupt. It was ludicrous. It took him an hour to finish his opening statements. So I'm not sure you can prevent that. I think that maybe is something that hopefully the Democrats realize didn't actually end, I think, playing well on TV, and the American people, I don't think, want that. But the other aspect of the process were the people who were there explicitly to disrupt the proceedings, to get arrested. More than 200 people were arrested throughout the process for standing up, screaming, disrupting. These are kind of the Code Pink style protesters. You had people funded by outside groups who, interestingly, were really candid and even told people, "Oh yes, Planned Parenthood, we're flying people in from Alaska because we want them to lobby Senator Murkowski. We're paying their travel costs. We're paying their hotel rooms. We're paying for their legal fees or the legal training, so they understand how most effectively to get arrested. And they were paying their bail to get them out so they could come back in and start the cycle over again. So this was not just a spontaneous movement. This was a real calculated thing. And as one of the leaders said, "Oh no, this isn't chaos. This is scripted." So this was a real effort to turn the hearings into this kind of chaotic moment. I think what they were hoping to do is say, well, this man is so bad that it's turning this process into a circus. I think what most of America saw is, no, he's not turning the process into a circus. You're turning the process into a circus. And I think ultimately it turned people off. And even frankly, some of maybe the Democratic senators, the old guard, the Patrick Leahy and Dianne Feinstein kind of they looked uncomfortable through that process. And so I hope that we will, by not having maybe the public aspect to the hearings, have a little bit less of that. Now, that doesn't mean outside in the streets, you're not going to have these protests. And remember how crazy the protests were when Kavanaugh was confirmed, people rushing the doors of the Supreme Court, that famous image of the woman who climbed up, on top of the statue, people taking their shirts off. I mean, it was ludicrous. And that all was before the level of protest and rioting we have seen throughout 2020. So I think the thing that I'm really concerned about is making sure that violence and that kind of protest, not in a hearing room this time, thankfully, but on the street doesn't happen. One of the other things Mollie and I learned in talking with some of the people in the Senate during this process is one aspect that even changed throughout the Kavanaugh process as a result of the insanity of the first hearings was the willingness to share confidential information with the senators. A lot of you will remember Senator Booker's Spartacus moment, where he took confidential information that was made available to the committee. And this is something that happens with regularity for Supreme Court nominations, for other judicial nominations, that there are either documents that are personal that have to be maintained confidentially, or in the case of Kavanaugh, he had worked in the administration. There were documents that might have a national security valence or other issues that they couldn't make them public, but they did make them available on a limited basis to senators of the committee with the agreement. These are White House controlled documents. The White House said you can have these, but you have to agree you're going to keep them confidential. Spartacus Booker said, no, I'm not going to keep them confidential. He released those documents. When he failed initially and realized he had inadvertently released a document that had already been cleared for public release, he went back and released some other documents because he was so intent upon violating the Senate rules. That resulted later in the Kavanaugh process, in that second set of hearings, that when the FBI investigation file was done, when they did that additional investigation of Ford and Kavanaugh and the handful of people who actually had information about those allegations, they didn't make that public. They didn't put it and make it easy for them to go through like they had done initially, where it was on servers and they could use search terms and really do this in an efficient way. If you wanted to have efficient vetting, that's how you do it. But they couldn't, because they knew it was too high of a risk that there would be leaks, because they couldn't trust their own senators. So then it had to be in a lockdown, in a SCIF, a secure facility where only a handful of people could come in at a time, and they were all scheduled moments to look at it. So unfortunately, that made the process much harder for the senators who actually wanted to do their due diligence and examine those materials. So I think it remains to be seen in this next confirmation hearing if there are similar confidential documents. I think we're not going to have the same issue, but just because we didn't have that kind of highly secure and top secret work that Barrett or Lagoa or anyone else on the list I think was involved in. But would they be willing to even have that kind of access to confidential documents by the other senators? There may be an unwillingness to share things because of the bad treatment of confidentiality before.
In light of what you just said, and sort of looking towards the future of what's going to happen in the next month or so, we already know that every single Democrat is going to vote against whomever President Trump nominates. They've already said that. It doesn't matter who it is. And so at that point, the hearings just become a fishing expedition for, can we find something, explosive? Given that nobody's really interested in the due diligence, couldn't the Senate just not hold hearings at all? I mean, in the old days, there weren't hearings. They did their due diligence on their own and they voted. Why do we need to have hearings?
I've actually heard a bunch of people saying that floating the idea of not having hearings. I want to point out that hearings are a good way for the nominee herself to be able to defend herself against whatever false claims are made about her as soon as she is named. So they do serve a good purpose that way. And I think that you'd have to provide a way to allow someone to respond to charges that have been made against them, about what the real issue is, which is some people aren't going to like her judicial philosophy, or about, something more scurrilous. But it is true that the process of having these hearings this way is a relatively recent innovation, and it really starts to take root, only 100 years ago. There's the direct election of senators. There's the, broadcasting of hearings. We have a bunch of people who were confirmed to the Supreme Court where we don't have an actual vote total because they just kind of went, this good? Everybody good with this? And someone would go on. So different than what we now experience. I did want to say one other quick thing about the kangaroo court question, if I might, which is that the Senate had already put procedures into place to not have something like what happened, and those procedures were not followed. After the Thomas hearings, which were basically exactly the same as the Kavanaugh hearings, you had tough hearings. After they concluded, then an allegation drips out from a senator's office, and then they have to do more hearings. They instituted a new way of doing things where, after you go through the hearings and you've done your background investigation and whatnot, there's also a time where senators can privately discuss anything that they want discussed. Let's say something comes out where there's a question, someone said that they lived at this address, but they didn't, or, something that just needs to be dealt with. Or someone writes a letter making a claim without substantiation of high school sexual assault. They already had built into the process a time for senators to ask the nominee anything about that. And for reasons that are known only to her, Dianne Feinstein chose not to discuss those at that meeting and to leak them at a later date. That was very frustrating to a lot of the senators on that committee because they knew the procedures were in place. Likewise, it was something that was really causing a problem for Senator Susan Collins, who's not on the Senate Judiciary Committee. But as soon as she saw the date of the letter relative to the date it was leaked to the Washington Post, she realized that something was wrong. Like if she'd gotten a letter like that, she would have immediately taken it to someone who could have done something about it. And so 6-week delay was very troubling for her.
So we've got a ton of questions relating to the upcoming hearings and speculating about how much of this is going to be repeated. So I guess I want to just generalize out and ask, these hearings were obviously a turning point, I think, not just in the history of the Senate and the history of the Supreme Court, but in our political history. The ghost of these hearings, the ghost of Kavanaugh's hearings, is it going to haunt this upcoming, I think we all agree it probably will, haunt the upcoming confirmation battle? But what are some ways do you think that this experience that the senators went through, that the country went through, that the nominee went through, is going to impact this upcoming confirmation hearing?
Well, we know that it's one of the first things that's going to happen as soon as a nominee is officially chosen is this woman is going to be hitting the books the way that Kavanaugh did, because they have to be ready for an insane number of questions. Imagine this is worse than the bar exam for any of you who have had to go through that fun process, because they're going to be asked so many questions about, it could be any topic area in law. They're going to be asked about their own record. You're going to have cases that you've decided that then you're going to be challenged on and have to be able to defend any decision you've made on the courts. If it's Barrett, any article she's written, and some of those came up during her confirmation process already. So I think we have to be thinking of the amount of preparation, which I don't think I fully appreciated until we talked to people. The Kavanaugh team learned just the binders full of just research and trying to get up to speed in every possible area of law that you could be asked for. That I didn't realize how much work goes into that on the front end by the nominee, him or herself. Then there's also, they're going to have to be ready to understand what they can and cannot talk about. Justice Ginsburg herself is famous for what often is now referred to as the Ginsburg standard, where she didn't answer questions about how she would rule on particular cases. She's not the first justice who had that position, because it is an issue of judicial ethics that you can't forecast how you would rule on a specific case. However, it's something that she kind of made famous because she so many times said she couldn't comment on a specific case. So you're going to have people at these hearings trying to make her, and boy, we know of all cases, we know that in Roe versus Wade, they're going to be trying to get the nominee to go on the record and say, how would you vote on it to overturn Roe versus Wade? The challenge here is, again, there's a judicial ethics question where if you're a sitting judge, and everyone who's a serious potential nominee here is, you can't forecast how you would in a case, or if you did, someone might say, well, they have to now recuse themselves in that case. So as Ginsburg said, you can talk about your approach to law, you can explain cases you've already done, you can explain the writing that you've already made, but you can't guarantee or forecast. She said, no forecasts, no hints. You can't say what you would do in a specific case. That's going to be something that's going to be really frustrating to people trying to get more information. Not all of them on the left. Some people on the right would like judges to be more explicit and say, oh, I would overturn Roe versus Wade. sorry guys, that's not going to happen. So, don't tune in thinking you're going to hear the big reveal on that question, because that's simply not something judges are in a position to do. But it is an opportunity, I think, to again, Amy, as Mollie was saying, explain and present your own position and approach to the law. So I think that actually could stand to be very educational. I think if you paid attention during the first Kavanaugh or the Gorsuch hearings, you probably did learn a lot about their approach to the law, and about how law should be looked at more generally. I do predict that these hearings are going to be a little shorter than those. I'm hearing people talking about maybe 3 days for those hearings. I think that's probably just fine. Most of these hearings have devolved into kabuki theater. I wouldn't cry if we stopped doing judicial hearings, because I just think there's only so much light that's shed on the individuals. But I would hope that they would get in there, ask some actually useful questions, skip the gotcha moments, and I think we have to also remember Kamala Harris is on that committee. She was using the Kavanaugh hearings effectively as a dry run for her presidential bid. And we talk about this in the book, the gotcha questions that she tried to play, the fishing expedition that she went on when she was trying to get Kavanaugh to admit that he had spoken to some individual at this law firm about the Mueller investigation. And he's going, oh my gosh, what is she? It's a perjury trap. What's she trying to get me to say? And then dropped it like a hot potato when she realized there was nothing there. I think we may see a replay of those kind of things, because now she's got an even bigger political stage to go on, and she's someone who's going to be in that room as member of the Senate Judiciary Committee.
I'll let Jennifer take the last question, but just because you happen to mention that, there was a question on our little list here. This one is from Debbie R, who asks, since you brought up Senator Harris, then she was only contemplating a run for president. Now she is on the ticket. I mean, is there some kind of conflict of interest issue in her participation in these hearings?
I don't think there's a conflict of interest. It's fine for her to participate in this, but I bet she will handle it much differently than she did in the Kavanaugh confirmation. She was one of the main grandstanders. She was really using it as a launching pad for her presidential campaign. And we write about some of the stories of how she was, things she did, and how flawed they were. She got so much attention for this time when she tried to set a perjury trap for Brett Kavanaugh. The media were so excited. She was saying, have you ever talked to someone at this 1,000 person law firm? And Brett Kavanaugh was very careful about not falling into a perjury trap. He was always so precise. He said, well, to whom are you referring? Or I don't believe so, but I'd have to look at the list of the employees. And she said, I think you do know, and that you're lying, or something like that. And the media were like, yay, she's wonderful. And it turned out that this really big, amazing research team that Kavanaugh had figured out who she was accusing him of talking to about the Mueller probe, confirmed with the guy that they had never talked about the Mueller probe. And it ended up fizzling into nothing. And I thought it was a really good way of understanding Kamala Harris. She gives a great first impression and you think she really has the goods, and then it all kind of fizzles at the end. She has to be much more careful this time around because she's trying to appeal to moderate voters. And so those types of grandstanding antics might not work as well for her. They might excite her base, but she's already got her base. And so I'll be curious to see how she handles it, but I'll also be curious to see how Republicans who are in tight races that are on that committee handle their seats as well. Joni Ernst is a new member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Tom Tillis is in a tight race, North Carolina. And so people can use these hearings, one way or another, but unfortunately, I don't find that we get much out of them in terms of understanding what someone's judicial philosophy is. So I hope more that the Senate Judiciary Committee will just get everything out about whoever the nominee's record is and discuss if there's something to discuss, but not waste people's time or open it up into a thing where people actually try to destroy someone's life. I think regardless of what you think of Brett Kavanaugh or any other nominee, it's really bad when people allow bad actors to try to destroy someone's life or their reputation or their family. And so I think we should be on guard against that, just as humans, or whether we're on the committee or we're journalists or we're just humans. We should really try to encourage much better behavior and more honesty about what we think about a candidate and why we oppose them or support them.
Well, I know we have to let you guys go soon, but I think that one of the things a lot of people in our audience want to know is who you predict the president might appoint on Saturday. We know he has a short list of several highly qualified women. Are you taking any bets?
Well, Carrie and I'll let Carrie, I mean, do you want to take it or can I go?
Go either way.
Carrie and I interviewed a lot of people for the book, and one of the people that we interviewed was President Trump. And we did talk to him a little bit about we talked to him about how he made his decision for the Kennedy vacancy. And we know a little bit about what he thinks of different candidates, and we know that he thought very, very, very highly of Amy Coney Barrett. And we tell the story in the book about how she ended up not being the nominee, but she was clearly in very top contention. And when we've talked to him since then, he continues to talk about her. I would not be surprised, given her strength, her record, how much people love her, that she was just confirmed a couple of years ago, so we kind of know what we're going to be dealing with. I would not be surprised if it's Amy Coney Barrett. There are many good women on the list, so people should be happy with whoever.
Let me just follow up. Let's hypothetically say that it is Judge Barrett. One thing that Justice Kavanaugh has said in his courses that he taught, and you quote this in the book, is that these things are won and lost in the first 48 hours. Already we see these crazy stories about Judge Barrett, how she was the model for A Handmaid's Tale, completely off the deep end hyperbole. If Kavanaugh is right that these things are won and lost in the first 24 hours, Carrie, what would be your recommendation to Judge Barrett to try to diffuse those types of critiques, or how would you suggest she present herself in the first 24 hours?
Right. Well, I think, and this is how I view both her and Barbara Legault, who I think is the other front runner we hear a lot about. I think either of those women would really be someone who, in my mind, is a inspiring follow-on to Justice Ginsburg. And I think obviously not in their judicial approach, but as Justice Ginsburg herself has said, women come in all different shapes and sizes. Right. They don't all agree with each other. And she said, I think people need to recognize that. What better way to carry on that legacy of accomplished women, mothers, scholars, than to have another woman follow in that footstep, showing that it's not just, there's not a monolithic female perspective. And I know you all appreciate that better than most. So I think showing the way that you are carrying on in that tradition would be very valuable. I think, Barrett has such an inspiring story herself. How many mothers of 7, including adopting 2 children from Haiti, have then risen to such heights in their career, and while being very involved and active mothers, and, then gone on to, become federal judges. This is really an amazing path-breaking accomplishment that she has done, much as Justice Ginsburg had to overcome a different set of challenges in her own life. So I think focusing on that compelling story and her role as a role model for young women, I think it's wonderful that we're going to have a role model for young conservative women on the court now. That's something we've had now several women justices, but we never had an originalist woman justice. And so I think bringing that diversity that Justice Ginsburg herself could have appreciated. And then also, I think you're right. We've seen some really nasty anti-religious claims, some of them coming from the same people who, like Kamala Harris, who thinks that the Knights of Columbus is a hate group, who thinks that, and Feinstein's attacks on Barrett are kind of legendary at this point in terms of her anti-Catholicism. But I think Barrett should lean into that because, like Justice Ginsburg spoke herself very eloquently about how her faith formed her role as a judge, how her Jewish faith inspired her to seek justice. And that was one of the inspirations for her life. I think that's something that most Americans, on the Democrats and Republicans, can agree is something that's actually not only an American value, a constitutional value. There is no religious test for office. So I hope that she, and I think she would, continue to stand strong and be unflinching in that. And then remind people, this is something that that is in the same line of people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, people like John F. Kennedy, who spoke very clearly about how their religion could inform and help their role in the public life, and that this isn't something to be afraid of or to shy away from. She did so well with that in her confirmation hearing, but I think we're about to see that 48 hours replay itself again. So it's going to be exciting to see.
Right, great. And if it's Barbara Lagoa, she'll have to tell Sonia Sotomayor that there's more than one wise Latina in the world.
Exactly.
Anyway, thank you for joining us, everybody. The book is Justice on Trial. I hope you'll all buy it if you haven't already. We're going to say goodbye to Mollie and Carrie now, but we hope to get some more questions from the audience. Inez and I are going to stick around for discussion, and we can bring some of you up on stage to give your thoughts on the book.
Yeah, on that great wrap-up note with Mollie and Carrie and the kind of glass ceiling breaking that we actually like here at IWF, thank you so much to Mollie and Carrie for joining us. But our discussion, as Jennifer says, continues. And don't forget, we have a couple lucky winners at the end of this of autographed copies of the book. So if you stick around, you can win those copies. So make sure not to leave early. And just as a final reminder, if you want to ask your question live on video, add a V. That's the letter V, like victory, after your question, so we can go ahead and bring you up on to the quote unquote stage, our little E stage here live. But just to kick off the discussion, Jennifer, we talked a lot about the impact on the process, on the way that senators might handle this, the way the procedures might change, the predictions. But what we haven't really talked about is the impact on voters, right? Mm-hmm. Because, I know that you and I talked about this while we were setting up for this event. Both of us kind of woke up angry after reviewing. We read this book when it came out, and then we reread it in preparation for this discussion. And we both woke up today like pumped up and angry just from the reminder of how unfair this process really was to Justice Kavanaugh and his family. How do you think the ghost of the Kavanaugh hearings is going to affect the whole country, and how voters, especially swing voters, perceive this procedure as it unfolds in front of us?
Well, I think certainly in 2018, we saw that with the midterm elections, the Kavanaugh hearings woke a sleeping giant. I mean, there were a lot of people who maybe they were never Trump conservatives or libertarians. Maybe they were just moderates or swing voters who, weren't thrilled about the president. And then this happened to this honorable person, and people were angry, and they went to the polls, and in some cases, they voted out people who voted against Justice Kavanaugh. Claire McCaskill lost her seat arguably because of her vote against Justice Kavanaugh. So I think it really did wake a sleeping giant, not just amongst sort of Trump skeptical conservatives, but also amongst moderates who care deeply about due process. Now, this time it's a little bit different. But I think if the left goes hard after a qualified female candidate who, in the mold of Justice Ginsburg is a path breaker of her own sort, I think that's going to upset a lot of people.
So this question is from Hadley.
Hi, Hadley.
Hi, Hadley. It's a two-part question, I think. So the first part is, what happened to Me Too? And we haven't heard much about it for about a year now, or more, a couple years. And then also, of course, all of the shortlist candidates are women. We talked about the two top ones, right? Barrett and Lagoa, but all of the shortlist candidates are women. How is that going to change this hearing? I mean, presumably it's harder to come out with a last minute sexual harassment allegation against a woman than it is against a man. But, what kind of things might we expect getting thrown, whoever this nominee is, getting thrown her way?
Well, I'm thrilled that he's considering a list of highly qualified women. I've never been one who thought that, Justice Ginsburg's seat is a woman's seat, just like I didn't think Justice O'Connor's seat was a woman's seat. Seats don't belong to different, the different sexes. They don't belong to different ethnic groups. That said, I was certainly hoping that either this pick or the next pick would be a woman, because as Carrie very clearly said, I think it's important for there to be a strong originalist woman on the court, both for jurisprudential reasons and frankly, so that the young women of America can see that there, are other philosophies and other ideas about the law that in my view are better for women. So I think it's terrific. I think you're right. The whole Me Too aspect of it, well, first of all, just because of so many things going on in our country right now, whether it's COVID or Black Lives Matter protests or riots or what have you, Me Too has sort of taken a backseat to those things. But particularly if the president appoints a woman, I don't think Me Too is going to be much of the discussion that we're having about her. You and I were sort of predicting offline what line of attack they would use, and you can almost predict it regardless of who the person is, the things they'll be digging around for, and try to come up with things they said when they were 13 years old, and whatever. I mean, whoever has a copy of Barbara Lagoa's high school yearbook right now could be selling it for a lot of money on eBay. But yeah, your guess is as good as mine. We just know it'll be ugly.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So we have a question from Amanda H., who asks, is the Federalist Society still a good judge of judges? And just to broaden out that question a little bit, we in the book, we read about how, the Federalist Society was involved in putting together some of these lists. And we talked with Mollie and Carrie about the lists and how it's become more explicit because of voters on the right being increasingly mistrustful, for a good reason, of the picks of Republican presidents with the Bostock decision. Because with Gorsuch, I feel like there was a total, everybody on the right was happy with Gorsuch's nomination. And I absolutely don't believe we should judge a judge by a single case, but the Bostock decision did shake, I think, a lot of people's faith in the conservative legal movement that was touted as a solution to Republicans' justice picking problems, right? Would you still say that the Federalist Society, and let's forget about one organization, but generally the conservative legal movement as constituted since maybe the mid 1980s, what can it do to restore confidence, right? When one of the judges on the list that was chosen by the conservative legal community did disappoint a lot of conservatives, including you and I. We have a Facebook Live discussion about Bostock and about the potential ramifications of that case. How do we rebuild confidence among GOP voters?
Well, you can never guarantee how a judge is going to vote, and nor should you be able to, right? It's not a political job. Judges have life tenure. And I think it's good that they have life tenure. They have it for a reason, which is to primarily protect them from political pressure, so that they don't bend with the polls or bend with the political winds. So we want to ensure that they have that insulation. At the same time, there is no recourse when somebody makes a decision that the people may not like, but that's just the way it is. I mean, the thing about conservative judicial philosophy is it's not a guarantee that people aren't going to, go in their own direction. But what conservative jurisprudential philosophy does is it cabins the decisions, and it provides a fence, if you will, beyond which people hopefully won't stray, because they're cabined by certain interpretive norms and statutory construction, and interpreting the law as written, not on the basis of what people do in other countries or penumbras and emanations. So you have these guideposts, but that doesn't mean that they will always be strictly adhered to. It's not something that anybody control. We can only hope that if you are an originalist, you do adopt a conservative jurisprudential philosophy, that you'll stick with it. I mean, you can't guarantee that people won't change over time.
So as we're inching towards the end of the hour here, it's my opportunity to announce our lucky winners. And if your name is chosen, then our friendly folks behind the scenes will reach out to you and arrange to have your winnings sent to you. So the signed book winners are Ann Johnson, Pam Kelter, and Christy Reed Hartwell. And the SCOTUS Cases mug winner is Eileen Parker. So congrats to you four. You're our winners. And with that, we regrettably have to start wrapping things up here. But thank you all for joining us today to discuss this important and couldn't be more timely subject. We scheduled this before we knew that there would be an upcoming confirmation battle. So it turned out to be very timely. We hope you enjoyed Justice on Trial as much as we did. And if you haven't read it yet, we highly encourage you to go out and buy it or buy the audiobook and listen to it. So thank you so much again for attending. Thanks for your thoughtful questions. I'm sorry to those of you who I didn't get to your questions. We just didn't have time to get to them all, but they were all very thoughtful questions. So thanks for those. And if you have any feedback about how the event went or how we could have made it go more smoothly or better, please send us a note on Facebook or email us at info, that's INFO, at IWF.org. So Jennifer, could you send us off into sunset with a last reminder about our awesome organization, Independent Women's Forum, and what we do?
Yeah, sure. It looks like there are a lot of new names here. So for those of you who aren't familiar with IWF's work, we just want to let you know that IWF is dedicated to developing and advancing policies that aren't just well-intentioned, but actually enhance people's freedom, choices, and well-being. We'd love to have you more involved with our organization, so please visit our website at iwf.org and sign up to receive the latest news, updates, and events from IWF. And if you're particularly interested in the courts and other legal issues, be sure to sign up for First Monday, the newsletter of the Independent Women's Law Center. Finally, we hope you'll follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And with that, it's time to say goodbye. Have a great weekend. Stay safe. And for all of us at Independent Women's Forum, thank you for joining us for IWF Reads. So long.